today I'm going to continue taking advantage of episode 1158 of the Joe Rogan Experience with the writer Chuck Palahniuk. But today I'm going to talk about writing that repels us, that repulses us, that makes us want to retch or wince or look away or even stop reading. What's the place for such writing in literature? Well, we've got Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs with his brutal scenes of homosexual sex. We've got Hunger by Knut Hamsun, where the protagonist puts his finger in his mouth and seriously thinks about eating it. We've got Arturo Bandini, who is the protagonist of Ask the Dust by John Fante, who pushes his girlfriend's face in the sand, basically tries to drown her after having sex with her at night on the beach. And we've got the rape scene from Tralala, perhaps the most brutal short story ever written, from Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby Jr. And of course, most apropos, we've got Chuck Palahniuk, who most famously wrote Guts. Perhaps not most famously, he also wrote Fight Club. But recently, relatively recently, he wrote Guts, which is a story that is based or set up by scenes of extreme masturbation. So there is a tradition of writers who take us to the darkest of places with forbidden language and topics and scenes of perhaps gratuitous sex, abuse, and violence. Is the appetite or the tolerance for such scenes less now than it used to be? Are readers, current day readers, overly censorious? Like too eager to claim that a story or a scene is inappropriate or insensitive or offensive? Well, let's see what Rogan and Palahniuk have to say about it.
For several years, I was in a writer's workshop, and the core group of us had been meeting since 1990. So this is a workshop that was almost 30 years old. And gradually, people were asking each other not to use certain words. First, nobody really used the N-word, but it was definitely a word you could not bring to workshop. And then in a story, I used the word faggot. And a very good friend of mine said, "You're not bringing that word into workshop. You're not writing anything with the F word." And it just became more and more tightly strictured that way. And so eventually I realized we were kind of writing to make each other happy instead of to kind of confront each other. And one of the writers in our workshop is a writer named Cheryl who had written a book called Wild, which was a hugely successful book. It was chosen as an Oprah book, and it will be on bookstore shelves for the rest of history, Cheryl's book Wild. But while she was writing it, she had written a segment about how as a child she would be sat on the sofa with her grandfather, and her grandfather taught her how to masturbate him. And so as a child, she would masturbate her grandfather until he achieved orgasm. And then later, she would find these featherless birds that had fallen out of a nest. And she picked one up, and she knew it would die. So she crushed it between her bare hands. This is a very small child. And she wrote how, as that bird died, crushed between her hands, its death throes, its spasms of death, felt exactly like her grandfather's penis ejaculating in her little hand.
Whoa.
That was the best thing she ever wrote. And her editor at Knut said, "That is not going in this book because we want this book to be a big book. And if we see you jerking off your grandfather and then killing baby birds, that is not going to make Oprah Winfrey happy." So it was a magnificent piece of writing and a magnificent kind of parallel and awareness for a child to have. And this juxtaposition of sexual abuse and death was magnificent. Oh my God, it worked on every level. But the publisher said this is not going to be in the book.
Palahniuk comes out with that anecdote after Rogan asks him about censorship or self-censorship in the literary world. If there are certain words or topics that are forbidden, and I'm not saying that there aren't, that readers don't tone down their content or language to appease readers' complacency or their political inclinations, or not to alienate themselves from corporate culture. But I also wonder if perhaps that stray-ed anecdote, or those two anecdotes, were perhaps pulled out not because of censorship, but because they didn't really fit into the larger narrative. I haven't read all of Wilde, but what I have read of Wilde has an underlying tone that wouldn't seem to support that type of scene. Let's see what else Palahniuk has to say about that book.
And there were so many parts of that book that were so much better than what they actually did publish.
Really?
And so it's that kind of censorship where you're trying to reach a reader standing in line at Starbucks, and this has got to go in that point of purchase stand, and it's got to be a face out. And I understand for a long time, if you wanted a face out at Barnes & Noble, especially on the Discover New Writers face out stack, you could not have the word fuck on the first page because they did not want people picking up that book and opening it and seeing the F word, that just did not fit their corporate culture. And so, so much of this censorship is because people really want to reach the largest audience without offending people.
But there's giant problems with that, right? I mean, one of the more fascinating things about books is that the story plays out in your mind.
Exactly. The nature of consumption makes it about the only medium in which you can go to those places.
Yeah, literally. You couldn't, there's no way you would be able to find, to put that in a book, her story about her grandfather and the bird. Maybe you could put the bird in, but the grandfather part, there's just no way.
I totally agree that literature is really the only artistic medium, other than podcasts perhaps, in which that stray-ed anecdote could appear. And when Joe Rogan says that there's no way that a scene like that could ever appear in a book, I'm sure that he got confused and that he misspoke, and that what he really meant was that there's no way a scene like that could ever appear in a movie. To work, it would just have to be too graphic. Books can still go places that other mass-marketed art forms currently can't. Still, I am not 100% sure that that story was pulled from Strayed's book for reasons of censorship. It might have been pulled for reasons of composition. Still, I get Palahniuk's point. Let's see what he says in this next clip.
The first workshop I was in was a lot of very nice ladies, and I was probably 28. And I had written a scene in which a young man, has done up an inflatable sex doll so it looks exactly like the woman he's obsessed with. And during the seduction of this sex doll, he accidentally snags the back of it with the zipper of its dress. And he realizes during the fornication that it is gradually losing air. So he's got to copulate faster and faster to try to achieve orgasm before this thing completely goes flat. And at the end of the scene, he's standing there with this completely deflated sex doll hanging off of his erection like this surrender flag. And of course, his mother walks into the room. And after I wrote that scene, the leader of the workshop I was in, my first workshop, she took me aside afterwards and she said, the other writers in the workshop no longer feel safe around you. She really did. She said, you've written something that really frightens them, and they would like you to politely leave the workshop and not come back.
So yeah, the reading public is what it is. Padded with very nice ladies who want to believe that everyone is more or less like them. Decent, discreet, prudent, considerate, who want to read and think, but inside very conventional boundaries. They might know that there's some really weird shit out there, but they don't want it thrust in their faces with indelible detail. And that's fair enough. The general readership for fiction is just a fact. It's not going to change much, and I don't think it's very new. If you write lurid, morbid, violent, sexually explicit stuff, then your audience is just going to shrink, which is more or less what Palahniuk is going to say in this next clip when Joe Rogan expresses disbelief about the prohibitive tendencies in the literary world.
I just don't understand how someone who's a creative writer can't understand the necessity, like the need to delve into the darker possibilities of human reality. I mean, the story she wrote about her grandfather in The Bird is a perfect example of that. I mean, although very few people will experience that in their life, we all can appreciate that these are possible scenarios.
And I think it really comes down to what people, what purpose reading and writing serves in people's lives. And most people, they want reading to be a comforting activity. They want to be able to read a book and then fall asleep knowing the detective will apprehend the killer by the end of the book, that things will end very well. In a way, they want to be bored or lulled by the book. Not so many people really want to be kind of confronted by books.
But there's also a market for your books. There's clearly a market for people that want to tap into those more disturbing aspects of consciousness and of reality.
And that market is moving to video games, and that market is moving to edgier films. There's just other forms of storytelling that are serving that market better.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Better than books?
Oh, yeah.
But why is that? Is that because of censorship, or is it because artists aren't exploring those ideas as much anymore?
You know, and part of it is because books are harder to consume. Books take an enormous amount of a commitment of time and effort to read a book, where everything else is 30 minutes to 2 hours.
I disagree that video games and edgy film better serve those of us who want to be confronted. No other art form can get into consumers' heads like a book can, for exactly the reasons that Chuck Palahniuk says. The time and effort required to consume it cause the content to have greater sway and influence on us, and to linger longer, and to be more insidious and less innocuous, let's say, just because people read less. That doesn't mean that books are any less effective at what they do best. In this next clip, Rogan and Palahniuk talk about why even good writers sometimes want to silence certain types of creative expression.
That fucking struggle, man. The struggle of wanting to express yourself as freely as possible, but being limited even by your own peers. That is, that's unexpected to someone who's on the outside of literature, someone who just reads it. Because it's not in the comedy world. Well, it is in the comedy world, but not amongst good comedians.
Well, another aspect of that is that so often people aren't censoring it because it offends them. They're censoring it because they're afraid it will offend someone they know. They're doing it, they're kind of white knighting on behalf of someone else. David Sedaris told me this story about telling a joke or something very funny about a girl in a wheelchair, and how he looked out in the audience and no one was laughing. They were all looking at a girl in a wheelchair. And the moment she started to laugh, the entire audience started to laugh.
Oh, yeah.
And so often people in a workshop, they might not personally feel offended by the word, but they're thinking how that word might hurt people they know.
Yeah, white knighting. Great term. But I just don't think we writers should be worried about that. I don't think we should be policing each other, even if our intentions are good. Nobody should be forced to read ruthless, brutal, potentially insensitive literature, but no one should be forbidden to write it either, or even discouraged from writing it, if those are the stories they feel most compelled to write. But what about gratuitous brutality? What about writing that sets out to provoke and to repulse just for the sake of it? Pure shock value. What's the point of that? Let's see what you think about this next anecdote which Palahniuk tells with almost too much gusto. Like in the previous clip, he refers to David Sedaris, who is a biting and very popular literary humorist.
Another really odd comic David Sedaris story is that he always told me, when you're on the road, don't read from your current book. Always read from the next book, because it's a way of road testing the stories and finding out which ones work and should go into the next book. And in doing so, he was telling this story about being in this forensic laboratory as an autopsy was taking place. And this autopsy table was adjacent to this huge indoor window that separated the autopsy suite from this lunchroom. And in the lunchroom were the rest of the forensic staff, and they were all eating their lunches. They all had tuna sandwiches and cans of Coke and barbecued potato chips. And they were watching through the window as this absolutely perfect 12-year-old boy was being autopsied. And just hours before, this kid, like 2 hours before, this kid had been riding his bicycle. He'd fallen over, he'd hit his head on the curb, and now 2 hours later, he was dead. And dead without almost a scratch on him. Just this perfect, naked, dead 12-year-old boy on the autopsy table. And as the technicians eating their lunch, watching it through a window, they watch as the pathologist incises around the top of the kid's face, at the top of the forehead, the hairline, and then peels the face down, like peeling an orange, peels the entire face off of the skull of this little boy and leaves the face around the neck like a mask, like a rubber mask. And this exposes this liver-colored, dark red musculature of the child's underlying face. And this one guy watching it with a mouthful of tuna sandwich, he points this out and he says, see that? That there? That's the color of red that I want to paint our rec room.
Holy shit.
And when Sedaris told that story in front of 600 people, it was dead silent. And you could hear people weeping. People were crying and they were hating David Sedaris in that moment. And that story never went in any book.
Wow. Did the story not go in any book just because of the reaction by the audience or just the uncomfortable moment? He just decided?
To my knowledge, that was the only time the story was told.
But maybe Sedaris would include it if he found the right narrative context to put it into. Right now, standing alone with nothing in front of it or after it with zero setup or development or reflection, it's just a disagreeable segment to perhaps something larger. Right now, there's nothing there to redeem it. And all the detail that Palahniuk puts into the anecdote just makes it more distasteful. But I'm not saying that there isn't a story or a narrative context in which that segment couldn't appear and still be art, which leads me to this next clip in which Chuck Palahniuk retells part of a Whoopi Goldberg comedy routine. This is clearly not the Whoopi Goldberg from The View and from Sister Act.
Do you remember the routine that kind of put Whoopi Goldberg on the map a million years ago about being a black surfer chick?
No.
Oh, she did it on television. I must have seen it on cable when I was like 19 years old. But she talks in Valley speak. Nobody's seen this Whoopi person before. She's brand new. Nobody's ever seen her on television. She's got this funny name. And she's doing this Val speak about being the only black surfer chick on the beach. And she loves surfing. And she loves this one white surfer guy. And she finally hooks up with him. And then she realizes she's pregnant. And it's all very funny. The whole front end, you're just roaring with laughter. And then she's pregnant. And she doesn't know what to do. So she gets a rusty wire coat hanger. And she goes into a public bathroom on the beach. And she gives herself a coat hanger abortion. And it spills out there on the concrete floor. and everything's okay. And now I'm back on the beach and I'm just doing fine. And why don't you come on down and see me here on the beach? It's great down here. It's great.
Holy shit.
It's a fantastic piece. And
she did that on television?
She did it on TV. And it started so light, like an Ira Levin novel. And then it went to such a dark, horrible place. And then it came up with just this kind of token, everything is okay ending. And that's the kind of comedy that I love.
Yeah.
Where it goes to that dark or that sentimental place and it breaks your heart. And then it kind of comes out of it a little bit.
So yeah, the coat hanger abortion is a foul element. As foul as that dead little boy's face being pulled down around his neck while forensic workers look on and eat their lunch. But Whoopi Goldberg, by playing a character, elevates it to the level of art. In the same way, I think that those two anecdotes from those two Strayed anecdotes, how one vile incident leads to and plays off the other, I think that's art too. I don't think there's anything gratuitous about that. I think it illuminates the way art should illuminate. The little girl clearly understands deep down that she's been damaged in some way, and although there will be casualties, she might recover. Those two anecdotes side by side make me think about all that. But it works so well as a standalone piece, and it's so strong that I can understand why it was taken out of Wild. If it were put into Wild, it would have knocked the story off kilter. Now, one last clip to drive my main point home. Rogan talks about what he thinks makes good writing. Let's see if we agree.
If you're going to censor people, if you're going to self-censor, if you're going to decide that people can't use certain words, if you're going to decide that certain scenarios are just too upsetting for the reader, these moments are going to be harder and harder to achieve. And these are the moments that we're going to talk about. Like if we were in here, if we were in a bar somewhere, and we were having a few drinks talking about great stories or great moments, these are the moments we would bring up. These are the impactful things.
It's probably true that when we get together with our buddies in a bar, we tell the most shocking and unforgettable stories in order to get a rise out of each other, but that doesn't mean that those stories are true, or not in a larger sense. Let me give you an example. Years ago, I had this beautiful British girlfriend. She was from an upper middle class family, and they had this gorgeous country house that they invited me to. And it was typically British. It had a tennis court, a clay tennis court. It had canals nearby with locks, this beautiful green lawn. So one day I was out there on the porch having a gin and tonic. And I remember my girlfriend was in this very elegant evening wear. And she decided in some moment to help her dad do some yard work. So she was going out on the lawn. They had a problem with moles. That was the only pest problem they had. And it was the only thing necessary to eliminate for the lawn to be the consummate perfection. So she was going hole to hole with this gallon jug of bleach in a funnel in this elegant evening wear, pouring bleach down these holes, one after the other. It is an indelible, unforgettable image to me, and it's absolutely true. But it wasn't true to her character. It was out of character for her. So if I were to include that anecdote in a story about our relationship, I would have to work really hard to balance it out so that anecdote didn't mark too severe a tone. For example, in this video, I think that anecdote fits perfectly, but I don't think it fits perfectly in the story of our relationship. And if I were to pull it out of that story, it wouldn't be because I'm censoring myself, or that I'm worried about offending her, or I'm worried about offending overly sensitive readers. I would be doing it for reasons of composition, to keep or maintain the integrity of the story. So, Anyway, I hope this video helped you think productively and constructively about visceral brutality in literature. If you can include it and you can make it art, go after it, man. But if you succeed, don't be surprised if people don't praise you for it, or if they don't want to read anything more that you've written. Thanks for watching, people.